excuse the gloom, but none may know of this meeting. The nature of my trouble is darker still. Over a year ago, King Lysandus of Daggerfall died honorably on the field of battle. He was as loyal a subject, ally, and friend as you are. I did grieve for him, but his spirit does not rest. With a spectral army, he haunts his former kingdom, crying for revenge. I do not know why a good and loyal man would be so cursed. Perhaps you can find the answer and close the marble jaws of oblivion, bringing peace to his soul. I ask this as your emperor and your friend. I have one lesser request. Several years ago, I wrote a letter to the Queen of Daggerfall. It never arrived. The letter was of a sentimental and personal nature. If you find and destroy that letter, I will be grateful. Now, my champion, rest well this night, for tomorrow you sail for the kingdom of Daggerfall.
To be honest, I kinda started this series specifically for the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. It's probably my favorite entry in the Elder Scrolls series, but I had never played through the main quest before this video. Its main appeal to me is the world and roleplay potential. Despite its somewhat barren landscape, the realistically scaled world provides the size, quantity, and, at times, depth to facilitate a genuine fantasy life simulator that allows the player to tell their own story. Of course, all of this was done in the context of pursuing my own goals and side quests, but taking on the main quest does still allow for much of this while giving you some of the best dungeons in the series. Being the culmination of what I believe they were attempting in Arena, Daggerfall really is a special entry in the Elder Scrolls series and in role-playing games as a whole. Despite coming directly off of the development of Arena, it was determined that Arena's engine was inadequate and not up to the task of continuing the Elder Scrolls series. Bethesda opted to repurpose X-Engine, an in-house 3D Bethesda engine that was previously used on Terminator movie tie-in FPS games. As mentioned in my Arena review, tie-ins were among Bethesda's biggest moneymakers at the time. Using this engine, it made it possible for them to be freed from the strict Arena engine constraints, allowing for a more massive open world and dungeons that make Daggerfall iconic. Seeing as the series already had a relatively definite direction, development was significantly smoother than that of the first Elder Scrolls game. The biggest thing was that former designer, now director Ted Peterson, wanted to improve about the game was its simplistic story, now aimed, and as I'll later get into, succeeded to be one of the most complicated stories that he could get out and into a video game. This, along with the groundbreaking use of procedural generation scattered liberally throughout the game, made for an experience that, while forward-thinking, remains inextricably linked to the design philosophies and technical constraints of its day. Character creation in the Elder Scrolls is most certainly at its peak in Daggerfall. With layered systems and granular control of pretty much everything your character is capable of, you can make pretty much any character you can imagine. That's why I think roleplay also really hit its stride in this game. With the broad range of creatable characters, along with a backstory generator of sorts, you can really get immersed in your character and, in extension, the world of the Elder Scrolls. It starts with you picking a race, still no orcs or Imperials unfortunately, but the Khajiit are a little more cat-like this time around rather than humans with face paint. Argonians are still all but useless, getting minor bonuses to swimming and a breathe underwater spell, but I still went with one because lizards are cool. In class creation, you can pick from a list or do a quiz like the last game, but this time you can also create your own. The built-in classes do tend to be weaker than those you can create yourself, but with the complexities of the systems, it's difficult to get your head around for a new player, so it's much easier to use one of the pre-made ones. The part that is best done in this game that was removed from later ones in favor of star signs is the special advantages and disadvantages system. This system allows you to change all kinds of things about your character, like what materials, weapon types, and armor your character can and cannot use, whether you can use spells, and other things like this. Not only does this open up increased roleplay opportunities, but also allows for tighter controls of character attributes, allowing you to min-max into your preferred playstyle if that's what you're going for. Adjusting these advantages moves the rate at which you level, and in turn the speed at which the game will progress. Some questlines are blocked until you hit a certain level, so having the faster leveling speed can be beneficial if you're trying to get through the game quickly. Once you're done designing your class, you can answer some questions about how your character's backstory has gone, giving them minor adjustments to stats, starting items, and fleshing out who they were before the events of the game. The most important item to get, if it is offered to you, is the Ebony Dagger, being a high-tier endgame item available to you right at the start. It's especially effective if your character uses short blades as their preferred weapon, but will always be pretty nice to have, as some enemies can only be attacked by certain tiers of materials, and ebony is one of the best materials in the game. You are a close friend of the Emperor Uriel Septim VII, and are sent by him to the land of Daggerfall to investigate the vengeful spirit of the recently passed King Lysandus, and, secondarily, find a letter of, quote, sentimental and personal nature sent to one Queen Minnesera of Daggerfall. For whatever reason, it never arrived, and he wouldn't want prying eyes to read it. On your way over, a storm of almost biblical scale materializes around your ship, crashing it and landing you in Privateer's Hold, a hideout for rogues, knaves, and other dark denizens of the Empire. Privateer's Hold is a relatively iconic segment of Daggerfall, as it's a common filter for newer players, especially two particular enemies. The imp at the start that will be unattackable if you can't use magic or didn't take the enemy dagger, and the skeleton warrior towards the exit who has high stats compared to the player. Aside from these two specific encounters, it's a pretty well designed dungeon and even has a decent enough built-in tutorial that guides the player through the dungeon. It's pretty tightly paced and should net you some decent starting gear, extra items to sell, and take you to level 2 or maybe even 3 depending on how fast you're leveling. It's pretty close to Gothway Garden, in fact within walking distance. It's a town just over the nearby hill, and it's got almost everything a new player would want or need. It's got a couple temples, both main guilds, and plenty of shops. It's a great little starting area and a nice way to make some starting capital before you get to the level 3 requirement to start the main quest. Once you leave Privateer's Hold, you're contacted by Lady Brisenna Magnusson, a fellow agent of the Emperor and unofficial ambassador to Daggerfall. She directs you to talk to the rulers of the kingdoms throughout Daggerfall to try to find more information on Lysandus' ghostly thirst for vengeance. Once you get to level 3, you're contacted by Morgaia, the Princess of Wayrest, which is one of the major kingdoms of the Iliac Bay. She tells you to go to the King of Worms, who's a lich and one of the other major players of the Iliac Bay, though not bound to a country or state. He gives you a note to give to Morgaia reading, Princess, done. Once you return to Morgaia, she thanks you for completing the quest and tells you that Gortwog, the leader of the orcs, has the letter that Uriel Septim was looking for. She tells you that he stole it from Queen Abkai of Daggerfall, though she doesn't know why Abkai would have it. She says you should contact Minasera, the former queen of Daggerfall, about it, as she would be most likely to know. Most of the game's main quest is like this, getting sent to get a letter or special item that has some plot relevance and deliver it to a noble or agent. You do feel like something of a UPS delivery guy delivering packages from person to person, but the story itself is pretty interesting with court intrigue, power plays from different parties, and espionage. One particularly obtuse quest, though, requires you to find a dungeon mentioned only in a single line of dialogue, go through it, and talk to the person trapped inside, Medora, the former court sorceress of Daggerfall, who was trapped here by a curse due to finding out about Minasera's affair with Lysandus. Not only is this quest very hard to find, as the island isn't even marked on the world map, but it's also required to beat the game and get past about 60% completion. Of course, to get through the main quest, you do have to explore the quite expansive world of Daggerfall's Iliac Bay, and we'll be getting into that shortly. The Iliac Bay is true to its real-life scale and about the size of Great Britain in real life. It takes around 60 hours to walk across without stopping and is without a doubt the biggest game world in the Elder Scrolls series. Thankfully, to supplement all this walking you'd have to do, there's a quite robust fast travel system that allows you to go nearly anywhere in the game from the start. Seeing as it has such a large world, most of it being procedurally generated, it is a pretty dead space. There isn't much to do between cities, and you won't find any interesting encounters like you might in later Elder Scrolls games or even in other contemporary RPGs. There are innumerable cities scattered around that within provinces. They aren't usually distinct other than capitals, just randomly generated minor towns. Sentinel in particular, though, was a well laid out city with a unique look that I liked spending a lot of time in. Most areas in the game are like the more minor towns, though, nearly copy and pasted with very, very little variation between them. Occasionally you'll come across a genuinely cool area, but especially unmodded, they're few and far between. By far the best part of the world, and the place you'll be spending far and away your most playtime, is in the dungeons. Large, interwoven labyrinths tangle in, under, and over themselves, through twisting, serpentine passages the player must trudge. Classical tabletop dungeon crawling is a clear and obvious inspiration. The system's light, grid pen and paper influence rings heavy in the halls of Daggerfall's underground levels, albeit without a party and no survival mechanics. It's here that I think the dungeons falter. While tabletop RPGs thrive in wars of attrition, 5, 10, even 20 encounters per day, slow-paced wars against enemies, puzzles, and even the environment itself. The issue in games like Daggerfall is in their lofty aspirations to try and recreate this feeling digitally. Unfortunately, it often fails to capture the freedom and adaptability only achievable in a pen and paper format. While they make for decently functional experiences, plundering dungeons isn't terribly satisfying. The combat's alright, the exploration is decent, but seeing as all of the dungeons in the game have significant randomly generated segments, there's a clear lack of intentionality in design. While they make for reasonably entertaining gameplay, the randomness and lack of cohesion leads them to feel unsatisfying and empty despite spending so much time in them. There are only a few notable moments throughout maybe the entire game that I can remember running from dungeon to dungeon. Probably the most interesting part of the dungeons in Daggerfall is their scale. Near monolithic tendrils spread like roots through miles of stone and sod. Saying these dungeons are large is an understatement. These put the later game's dungeons to shame and are almost reminiscent of the gargantuan multi-level structures from 2nd edition, Advanced D&D, and the like. But as said in my previous segment, it lacks the nuance found in those games. Likely the biggest downfall of Daggerfall is its lack of survival mechanics. I feel there could be really interesting attrition-based gameplay, but it really ends up just being hacking and slashing your way out of dungeons with the really, honestly, lackluster combat mechanics. The combat in Daggerfall, like most Elder Scrolls games, is based on dice rolls. You hold the right mouse and vaguely swing in various directions, an uncommunicative and not terribly satisfying or skillful playstyle. Each type of weapon feels the same, swing and hope you hit. The ranged combat is similar, but also comes with the added difficulty of aiming. It starts relatively frustrating, missing attacks more than you hit, but quickly becomes relatively consistent. You can really feel your character improving as the stats increase, but I feel the combat really isn't what it could be, and is maybe the biggest reasons the dungeons get boring, aside from my previously stated qualms. Definitely the more interesting part of combat, though, like in its previous incarnation in Arena, is the magic. The magic system, like in Arena, is in-depth and complex. This time you've got some extra layers of spellcasting to mess around with, as well as a number of new effects. Notably, as a huge fan of the spell, Passwell's absence saddens me somewhat. Of course, it couldn't be implemented very easily in an RPG with a third dimension to its dungeons, but it does just contribute to what I was saying previously about CRPGs not entirely living up to their pen and paper equivalents. The spell creation, though, has been toned down just a touch in that the scaling of spells isn't quite as powerful as it was in the first game. You can make any spell scale still quite powerfully with level, but it will be quite expensive in terms of magic points used on the spell. It's more efficient this time around to play a happy medium of tuning the spell just right out of the box, and also still making it scale with your level. But if you take increased magery in character creation or have a high intelligence stat, you should have enough magic pool to just brute force it. The guilds are a bit of a step down from most of the other Elder Scrolls games. While they have the same fundamental premise, a group of people that come together that you can use services and get quests from, but unlike in later games, particularly Oblivion's Dark Brotherhood and the interplay between the Fighters and Thieves Guild in Morrowind, you don't have any storyline to speak of. This hurts especially the Dark Brotherhood and Thieves Guild, as the actual utilities of these two aren't terribly useful, and a little bit of fleshing out would help significantly. The most common bugs I ran into during my playthrough were related to quest items in dungeons. At times, the quest item wouldn't spawn, or would be in a place that's not accessible, so unfortunately I'd have to use commands to get to it. Though I can count on one hand the amount of times it happened over my 30 or so hours of playtime. Crashes also happen occasionally, but personally I only crashed a single time, as the Unity port goes a long way towards fixing the stability issues and other bugs. Again, there are a number of community patches that I wasn't using in order to get a more authentic experience that I'd probably recommend you to download, that almost certainly would have fixed the issues that I ran into. There are a number of game-breaking bugs if you aren't using some of these community patches, but I was lucky enough to avoid them. In this segment of the video, I'll be explaining pretty much all of Daggerfall's story, so if you don't wish to be spoiled, please skip to the timestamp on screen now. Despite the main quest consisting mostly of fetch quests, the actual background story is very interesting, with a great deal of political intrigue, plot twists, and interwoven events. From the start, it seems relatively simple. Pacify Lysandus' vengeful spirit, and take care of the missing letter. Nice and easy. It very rapidly becomes much more complex, going from a simple fetch quest to a tale intertwining all the major factions of the Iliac Bay, changing the fate of the Empire forever. The main players in this story are of course Daggerfall, but also the kingdoms of Wayrest and Sentinel. Along with these three kingdoms, there's also the King of Worms, the Underking, and Orsinium, the unofficial homeland of the Orcs. During the War of Bettany, the name of a few books in the game, and the events that kick off the main story, Lysandus is killed and Gothrid takes his place as the King of Daggerfall. King Cameron of Sentinel is also killed and is replaced by Queen Akathiri, as Abkai is married to Gothrid and becomes the Queen of Daggerfall. This is more or less where the situation lies as the player, the agent of the Emperor, starts their quest. Despite assuming that Lysandas was killed during the Battle of Cringane Field, it was in fact a double that was killed. Lysandas faked his death to spend the rest of his days with his ethereal lover, Medora, the very same that was banished to the Durrani Tower on the Isle of Balfaria, where you go to early in the game. Lysandas made it away and managed to have the impersonator killed and pronounced dead, making Gothred king. A noble of Wayrest, Lord Woodbourne, is the person who provided the double for Lysandas and also kills the real King Lysandas during his escape, attempting to tie up any loose ends that might not allow Daggerfall to support him in taking control of the Kingdom of Wayrest. This is where Medora Durrani comes in. The player must, of their own volition, as previously mentioned in the review, go to Durrani Tower and find Medora in order for her to produce a calming substance to contact Lysandas' vengeful spirit. After you find out about all this from Lysandas and kill Lord Woodbourne, and hand his diary off to a noble of the Iliac Bay, preferably someone related to Lysandas, they must then do the second part of the quest, take care of the letter. Like the first quest, this is seemingly quite simple. Find the letter and dispose of it. The issue is what the letter contains. The letter reads, "Queen Minnesera, I have grave news. The totem of Tiber Septim has been found. You know what this means. The power behind Tiber Septim could be unleashed upon Tamriel again. Rumor has it that Lord Woodbourne, a minor lord of Wayrest, has possession of it. He will doubtless lose it soon. You must persuade him to turn it over to you or Lady Brisciana. The court of Wayrest has no love of King Lysandas, but you still have influence there. I am asking you to use it on my behalf. From Uriel Septim, the Emperor of Tamriel." As stated, it was intended to be given to Queen Minnesera, but was only addressed to the King of Daggerfall, meaning it was actually given to Queen Abka'ai, who, as previously mentioned, was recently betrothed to King Gothred, the current ruler of Daggerfall. One of the queen's handmaidens stole it and sold it to Gortwog, the leader of Orsinium, who produces copies and spreads them out to all the big players of the Iliac Bay. This totem of Tiber Septim is actually a controller for the Numidium, a powerful Dwemer war machine once wielded by Tiber Septim and his own battle mage Zurin Arctus. Tiber Septim's use of Numidium was liberal and vast, using it to conquer all of Tamriel. This angered Zurin, and he attempted to take back Numidium, so it wouldn't be the source of so much suffering around the Empire. In doing so, however, he was killed by Tiber Septim and his soul stolen, but with his dying breath, he put some of his remaining soul into the Mantella and remained in a state of undeath until the current era, now known as the Under King. The Mantella is a powerful soul gem containing life force from both Tiber Septim and the Under King, and is the power source of the Numidium. After the agent receives it from a pocket dimension known as the Mantellan Crux, an area designed to keep it safe from prying hands, they give the totem and the Mantella to a person of royal blood, giving them full control over Numidium and deciding the future of the Empire and for all of Nirn. Despite there seeming to be a lot of player agency in the story, and within the actual game there is, as with many long-running series, the Elder Scrolls Age has retconned a lot. The biggest retcon, maybe in the whole series, is an event called the Warp in the West, what is gonna be known in the future as a dragon break that somehow caused every possible ending of Daggerfall to happen simultaneously. When you've got 6 different endings and more games in the series, I suppose it's easier to have them all somehow happen concurrently rather than choose one to go with. Despite this seeming and honestly being somewhat of a cop-out, it works functionally enough and sets the stage for future Elder Scrolls games, especially Skyrim. In conclusion, the story itself is really good, and the roleplay elements are honestly great, but actually playing through the main story suffers from a lot of the same issues that Arenas did. The game functions better as a fantasy life simulator first and foremost, and a dungeon crawler second, and worst of all as a game that you can set out to beat the main quest. There are much better dungeon crawlers of the time, Ultima Underworld 1 and 2, Dungeon Hack, and the like, and honestly, Daggerfall is not one of the better ones. Played with side quests and exploration, however, Daggerfall can really be great. As is common with most Elder Scrolls games, the main quest is far and away the worst part. I'd say this trend holds true for all except our next game, Morrowind, which I'll be releasing a review for when I get around to it. Thank you for watching, have a good one, please leave a like and subscribe, and stay tuned for my next videos.